I'm going to kick off this panel with two stories to get the conversation going. And they're two stories separated by space, time, and possibly, in a first for IMARC, kind of altered states of consciousness. The first one takes place in London 2 weeks ago, where a regulator that you probably don't think much about issued a really interesting ruling. This is the UK's Advertising Standards Authority. And the interesting ruling they issued was about some advertisements that had appeared on bus stops in London and in Bristol. And the ruling was that those advertisements were dishonest and should not be run again. Those ads were by HSBC, and they talked about the bank's strong commitment to meeting net zero and addressing climate change emissions. And the Advertising Standards Authority ruled that those advertisements omitted material disclosures about the bank's other investments in climate change intensive industries. And so that complaint was upheld. That regulator says that those ads and ads similar to that should not be run again. And my question for this room doesn't need to be answered now, but how well would we, the organisations in this room, stand up to that kind of scrutiny, whether it be from an advertising regulator or indeed any other regulator? Now to the altered states of consciousness with my second story. At about 3 a.m. this morning, my wonderful 18-month-old toddler decided that it was an excellent time on the day of presenting to IMARC to let me know that it was a good time, that I should be a human climbing frame, and that she was going to have a great time singing loud songs between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. So as in the dark, my small 18-month-old clambered all over me and sang loudly. She sang what is currently her favourite song. Her favourite song is Turtle, Turtle, Little Star. And as I sat there, sleep-deprived, thinking about the deeper meaning of Turtle, Turtle, Little Star, I came up with 3 options as to what Turtle, Turtle, Little Star could mean for us. Turtle, in this case, could just be her pathway to twinkle. She's got 2 things confused, but hey, it's okay. It's a great wee song she's singing. She'll get to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star eventually. The second option, which I'm sure she's pretty convinced of, is that Turtle, Turtle, Little Star is actually a far superior formulation to the original, and that's where we should be. The third one is that Turtle, Turtle, Little Star is a bunch of nonsense spouted by an 18-month-old at 3 a.m. in the morning. I'll leave you to judge based on how this panel goes as to which it was. But turning to you, Tzila, and sorry to give you such a weird introduction, thinking about ESG, which is it? Is it a pathway to something better, something a bit more accurate? It's confused a few things, but we'll get there eventually. Is it actually a great final destination, or is it a bunch of nonsense?
I'll take option 1. I think it's a pathway to greatness. I think that we still have problems, but in general, it's been a really positive thing for the industry and for companies because it's lifted the conversation to the boardroom level. I'm a sustainability practitioner. For the last 5 years, all I've done is sit and talk to boards and executive level management, whereas 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was kind of stuffed in the HSEC function somewhere doing reporting. So I think it's really lifted that conversation to the board level. I think it's definitely motivating and driving change in companies, which is a good thing. And I think that companies are looking at it as really a kind of transformational process. And that, for me, means that it's a pathway to kind of the next step.
Mike, one, 2 or 3 on the toddler scale.
I think I'll agree with my fellow panellist on the pathway, and I think it's been a really interesting evolution over the last 20 or 30 years. Where, you know, if you go back that far, some people were doing good things, some people were doing nothing, some people were doing bad things in our industry. But as time has evolved and more sort of focus has come on, this business is actually more about just making money And it started with people talking about triple bottom line, and then this language around ESG has evolved in the last 5 years. I think it's been a really useful kind of framework or catchphrase or acronym to kind of group together all the parts of the business that aren't necessarily just related to how we reduce costs and how we increase revenues. And that's become a critical part of the business. I think its time is now moving towards a broader definition, and I think we'll get to the concept of sustainability rather than talking about ESG, because every aspect of ESG is effectively to do with sustainability. But I think we shouldn't sort of deride it in terms of the as a 3-year-old babble, because it's been a really important transition. One anecdote about if you went and talked to investors in the mining industry even 5 years ago, and you said, I only want to come and talk to you about ESG, you would get usually a first or second year out of university analyst that would come along and take some notes and disappear. If you go in today and say, we're coming around, we just want to talk to you about the ESG aspects of our business, you'll get the fund manager, possibly the fund manager's boss, 2 or 3 of the other analysts, as well as the now ESG analyst who's at a much higher level than they were. And that's happened quite quickly. And that's been one of the driving forces, so sort of iterative driving forces that have driven the industry to continue to change.
But it needs to progress. It needs to go more than that, because it needs to be, we shouldn't have to have separate conversations about ESG in the business. We should be able to have an integrated conversation where the value of both the ESG components and the business components are reflected together and make up the full story of the company. And I think that's kind of where we have to go.
So you said you're seeing the change in the C-suite in the paper. What does that look like now compared to, say, 5 years ago?
So I think now it's become a much more strategic conversation. So it's not just about the bolted-on sustainability piece. It's very much about how do we build it in. At Newcrest, we're going through this process at the moment, trying to think through how do we make sure that we build in these values into our business. So it's about strategy, it's about decision making, it's about operationalizing these things at site level. It's a completely different conversation. It's really, I would say it's kind of more a conversation about change management and transformation, and how do you use sustainability to motivate that, and how does sustainability give you the framework of that transformation. So I think it's really changed completely to what it was 5 years ago. I think ESG is the driver, and it's great because it's kind of pushed it up to that conversation, but the hard work is still to come. And a lot of us here have actually been doing a really good job at this. Now we just have to contextualize it in this very different way and bring it into some critical business behaviours, I would say.
So we've talked a bit about who's benefiting from ESG, from this framing of ESG. Is there anybody who's not benefiting from ESG? Mike?
I can't really see who's not benefiting from this evolution towards, and I agree completely with the point on integration, but I can't really see who's not benefiting. And whereas you see, a large number of stakeholders right across our industry benefiting quite a bit, one could argue that, for example, in carbon reduction, we are actually taking shareholder funds and spending them on programs that aren't strictly speaking legally required. So you could say the shareholders may be losing out on that cost. But I don't buy that argument, because you come back to the sustainability of your business and looking around at what's happening in the real world and realising that doing those things become absolutely essential to delivering the returns to the shareholders. So I can't really see who isn't benefiting from this trend.
Tzila?
No, I agree. I don't think there's anyone that's not benefiting. I think it depends on how you define benefit. Yeah. There is obviously a cost. Transformation will always be a costly exercise. But I think if you're playing a long game here and you understand what the transformation is going to be like and what kind of value we're going to have at the end, then no, I think the world will benefit. I think this idea that, I think all of us in the room today, and a bit of this was in the conversation yesterday in some of the sessions, where we've been speaking quite a lot about this license to operate idea, this idea that we need access to resources, we need permits, we need to be understood as being part of the energy transition. If that's the case and we can see where the world is going, these things are going to add tremendous value to our sector, to be able to articulate them really clearly, to be able to measure our performance, to have it integrated and strategic in the way that we approach it. For us as a sector, I think it's just benefit all around. It should help us with our permitting. It should help us with the conversations we have with investors. It should help us with the conversations we're having with our communities and our other stakeholders, and most importantly, with our employees.
But you've led neatly into my next question around, but how do we define it and how do we measure it? Because the obvious criticism is that there's a lot of leeway there and a lot of willingness in parts of the world where we're talking about ESG. So right back to you on this, how do we best measure it? And actually, who gets to do the measuring? Who defines the right measures? Is it us? Is it the investors you're talking about? Is it our host communities? They are, after the front line of the good and the bad of how we perform?
So I think it's us. So I think we know our business. We understand our risk profile. We understand where the opportunities lie. And in fact, we have the strategies to execute on those opportunities. So we need to be able to measure that performance ourselves. And I think that it's really important. But I don't think it should be done in a vacuum. So I think that once we understand what the strategy is, once we understand how we're going to measure performance, what are those pieces that are critical for us, what is fit for purpose for our business, then to have the stakeholder conversation to make sure that we're considering the value that our external stakeholders and internal stakeholders bring is the way to kind of get that final measuring piece right. So in terms of process, that's kind of where I think it needs to go, and that's where we're working to at Newcrest. I think in terms of technical measuring, that's kind of a whole other Pandora's box, because there's some things that are really easy to measure and there's some things that are really difficult to measure, and how do we use those metrics to tell the story of the business becomes a whole other story.
Mike, measurement?
Yeah, I broadly agree again, but I think it's really important to look at what are we trying to measure? So what's the framework that we're, in each of these different areas of the business, what's the framework that we're trying to define? And then what are the targets within that framework that we're trying to meet? And then how do we actually measure how we're going with those targets? And I think the pressure on measurement is only just starting, and it's going to get much more intense. Certainly what I'm hearing from investors is say, no more nice stories in your sustainability report, thanks. What we want is hard targets, where you are on the targets, and where and when you're going to get to the targets that you've set for yourself. And so I think the measurement's really key. But I do agree completely that the company's usually best placed to set those targets and then work out how they're going to measure it with input and reality checking. And back to your story on HSBC has said, a lot of kind of, not supervision isn't the right word, but a lot of kind of external verification. And then in relation to something like carbon reduction, where we're not just doing it in a vacuum for ourselves, we're part of a global target that has to be met if we're going to avoid the impacts of further climate change, then there has to be some regulatory framework around that. Then you come, so each group of stakeholders is probably different. When you come to community, for example, long gone are the days where the company should take a paternalistic view around what we're going to do with the benefits that we're going to give to you, and we'll decide what we do, whether we build a school if it's in a developing country or how we dole those out. That has to be a process of very co-creation, if you like, of very direct collaboration with the stakeholders.
Yeah, I want to launch into the co-creation thing, and And by way of example, like yes, we know our business is best, we need to measure ourselves, but the example I'm going to give you is for 3 years I worked at a site which was protested, if not on a weekly basis, definitely a monthly basis. And pretty much nothing I said was ever going to be accepted by the people who were objecting to that operation, regardless of actual performance. And one of the lessons I take out of that is actually, are we the right people to be setting our own standards? Surely there are roles for, so multi-stakeholder initiatives, as you said, co-creation. So we've heard a lot over the past couple of days from EITI on that front, where they bring NGOs into the room to help on the measurement framework. So views on external frameworks or bringing people from outside of the industry into that measurement role, because I'm worried that if ESG is for us to define, then it's not going to meet the scrutiny of regulators or indeed of the community.
Okay, I'm happy to kick off on that one. I think it's an essential part of the process, because, I mean, really, in a way, what you're referring to is the trust in the organisation. And I'm very proud to chair the board of a company where the whole ethos of the company is around building trust. Firstly, with the, at IGO, it's a purpose-driven organisation, we like to call it. So firstly, with our own employees, that, you trust what the company does and then they become part of it. And then externally, if we're thinking about exploration, the first boots on the ground are usually a geologist literally walking across, an area. The words that person says, how they turn up, what they present, how they describe what they're about to do or what they would like to do, how they ask for permission, how they, explain, that's all about generating trust. Now, having built the trust, some external verification of that trust, I think can be incredibly valuable. And certainly in things like, carbon reduction again, having external verification of offsets is essential. No one's, even the most trustworthy company, I don't think, will be believed when they say, well, we've done the calculation around planting this tree. That has to be externally verified.
Yeah, I think the issue of trust is it's difficult, and I agree. Like, I think you do need to have collaboration, and you do need to bring others potentially into those conversations. I think on the question of international of standards,
yeah.
I think it was. Look, I think the standards definitely have a role to play. I think where there is difficulty is when it overtakes action. So what you actually want a standard to do is you want a standard to drive positive action. When you have duplicative standards or you have standards where you subscribe to but actually they don't necessarily talk to each other, you create constraint, you don't actually create progress. And so when we're talking about, international standards or standard setting for, collaboration or whatever it is, or performance or disclosure, I think we just need to be very careful about making sure that these things work towards the absolute purpose of our organisation, which is actually to progress action on the ground. So what I fear about some of these standards is that we spend all our time trying to meet standards and disclose against standards, and only a small amount of our time actually affecting change within the organisation.
And there's that real opportunity cost. So the last piece of the standard that is least helpful to the organisation takes huge amounts of time to implement and takes people away from actually tasks where they could be making a real difference.
And also you need to really focus on materiality. So not every company is the same, not every mine is the same. So things need to be quite fit for purpose. One mine site might have a water issue, and so we want to really focus on the water piece. Some might have, an emissions, in terms of emission reduction, we have some constraint around emission reduction, so we want to think through how we might do that at that site. So I think, coming with these kind of overarching standards is great in terms of setting some kind of consistency maybe across the sector, but we need to make sure that it doesn't displace action on the ground.
Does that, you talked about there's the risk of kind of overlapping standards and confusing standards. Some people might say a role for regulation there, or is it? right?
You know, we work in an international industry where we're dealing with different jurisdictions at the local, you know, state and national level. We're dealing with international bodies that you know, maybe have, you know, frameworks that apply internationally. It would be great if we could have one set of standards, one set of policies, but the realism of that objective is, you know, further down the road. You know, I'd argue that, you know, the progress that we're trying to make in carbon reduction around the world is a good example of, you know, that would be a place to start because it's an existential problem that's in front of all of us. But I think in the meantime, we just have to accept that there's going to be different levels of supervision, different levels of stakeholders that we have to take account of, and we have to manage within that.
I think also there is a notion, there is kind of progress internationally to try and get some consistency. Yeah. I mean, I was at the ICMM last week, and one of the sessions, somebody put up a slide with all the voluntary and mandatory disclosures required around climate.
Only one slide.
Yeah, well, they managed to kind of squeeze it all into a spreadsheet, and it was astronomical. You know, how much was there, how much was duplicative, and yet if you're an international company, you have to kind of tick the box on all of these. There was the US, the EU, TCFD, you know, GRI, ISPI, SASPI, like all of these things around greenhouse. And it was really, I think it was a great kind of visual to really show us, you know, how these standards are not always talking to each other, are duplicative, are taking up a lot of space. So, you know, the sooner we can try and get to some kind of cohesion around them or you know, bring them all together in one, which I know IFRS is trying to do, the better it will be for the industry.
And ICMM is probably an example of where the industry can actually push for that change and actually, you know, from a policy perspective, lobby and make sure and try to internationalise as much as possible one set of standards.
Yeah. And we're struggling with climate at the moment, but we've got some big headwinds coming our way. We've got you know, all the disclosures around nature. We've got things coming around specifically in the water area. You know, what's going to happen around human rights disclosure. There's a lot of conversation around that at the moment. So we're seeing this across kind of the ES and G, if you want to, you know, thematically through the whole ESG space.
Yeah, and of course then the flip side, and it kind of goes back to your geologist in the field point, and sorry, how many exploration geos in the room? Only two. We've failed as a conference.
There's more than that. There's got to be more than that.
3, and the third one's really nervous about admitting that they're an exploration geo. 100% you guys are the front line on this, like in terms of the number of projects I've worked on which have been made or broken by exploration geo behaviour at that first point of contact. It's such an important piece. But it speaks to culture, right? Which is, yes, standards, but how do we imbue kind of focus on behaviour and culture and organisation? So you talked, Mike, about kind of it starts from a point of trust. Like, so how do you build ESG culture, for want of a better phrase?
How do you build ESG culture? I think it starts from the culture of an organisation, and usually culture starts from the top, but again, we like to think at IGO as an example where the culture shouldn't just be driven from the top. It actually should come from the bottom and come from every part of the organisation, but also it should be consciously created and consciously thought about. What culture do we want? How do we want to develop that culture? And what are we going to do to ensure that employees buy into the culture and then act out that culture? And I think that's an evolution in most corporates, but I think in some ways we can probably lead again in the mining industry because we are such a unique beast in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for me, I think culture starts with purpose. I think if you can have a really clear social purpose for the company, which is something we need to start considering more in this sector, that we're not just there about, you know, mining minerals or metals. We're there because we have actually got a social purpose. We are contributing to the energy transition. We are connecting people. We are, you know, a process for socioeconomic development. And if we understand the purpose, that will start getting people internally really directed around some commonality. And then, it's kind of just understanding people. We should ask you that question, right? It's like the psychology of people and behavior. How do you actually mobilize a workforce around a really clear purpose and understanding that sustainability is part of the journey that the company has to make?
So, final wrapping up, we're on our last kind of minute or two. If 2021, my LinkedIn feed was yay ESG, and 2022, it was, oh God, ESG, what a mess. I don't know what 2023 is going to be, but if you could insert one letter, one word into ESG, what would it be? Really quick vote for an extra letter.
Oh, I wouldn't add a letter, sorry. I would just say, for me, it's about depth. It's about how do we get deeper, clearer, how do we actually integrate sustainability in its full context within an organisation.
Right, another letter?
I think with what we've all been through in the last few years and continue to deal with, I think resilience, ARFA resilience has got a big part to play in our industry going forward. But I think as well, we're moving beyond letters and acronyms. We have to talk about how do we make our business sustainable from the core.
And to close out, I'm with you, the depth, and particularly on the S and the G. I kind of feel like the E is really big, and then it's E, and then in a lot of these conversations. Thank you for what's been an awesome conversation. There's a lot of conversations around the ESG topic happening in some of the parallel streams today, so please come along to those. Thanks for today. Cheers.